Hello. If this live stream is working, which I very much hope it is, welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Tyron. I'm the head of research at Find Out Now, which is a polling company and panel in the UK. And in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about reform and very specifically how I think pollsters in general are currently understating the reform vote share, with reference to three factors in particular, which is engagement, turnout, and false recall. And before I begin, I just want to mention that this isn't necessarily a presentation about why people are voting reform. So I'm not planning to speak about the long-term effects of Brexit or political realignment or whatever it may be, but more specifically, the pollster and polling industry mechanics, which are, in our view, causing them to be undercounted. So if you came here hoping for me to talk about the red wall or something, like this may be not the presentation for you, but hopefully you find it interesting nonetheless. So I will move on to this slide. And just as a quick aside, I don't know what this yellow background is behind me. We share an office with a film company and they've got posters up, so hopefully it kind of adds nicely to the color scheme. But yeah, so the structure of this presentation will be firstly discussing who we are, who that is, who I am and who Find Out Now are, and why we're doing this presentation. Then I want to talk about some long-term polling trends. So not just our polling or current voting, but really polling going back decades and what that tells us about, the state of public opinion in the UK today. And then I'll outline those specific factors which are, in my view, causing reform to be understated in current polling. So not to give away the spoilers, but that is too many highly engaged respondents, turnout being overstated, and false recall of 2024 general election vote. And then afterwards, there'll be time for questions. There were some questions sent in the form already, which we'll go through. But if you have any, simply, whenever you feel like it on the YouTube live stream, just put them in and then they'll be shown on the screen at the end. I should also say, if you have to run off or you can't guarantee you're free for the entirety of the hour at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, that's fine. The YouTube link will remain the same once the live stream is ended and will be viewable after. So hopefully that all makes sense. So cool. Firstly, who is Find Out Now and what do we do? So Find Out Now is both a pollster and a panel. And it's important to make this distinction. I trust it'll be relevant. I promise it'll be relevant. A pollster is somebody who kind of asks questions. They set up a survey, get 1,000 or 2,000 or how many respondents it may be to fill out the survey, and then they report the results. So they're kind of a middleman in that they kind of have a client from one end who wants the results. They get the respondents from a third-party company and they throw it all together. By contrast, a panel is actually where the respondents come from, i.e., if the respondents log onto a website and sign up to do surveys and receive email reminders and etc., that is a panel. And Find Out Now does both. So we're both a pollster, we run polls and publish the results, but we're also a panel, i.e., we are the website that people come to do the specific surveys, which we then report on. And each day we have over 100,000 people who are doing surveys, which maybe makes us the largest single source panel in the UK. I put maybe because I don't quite know how big YouGov is. I don't think that data is public, but in any case, we're comparable in size to them. So 100,000 respondents every day doing surveys. Although it must be said that our surveys are kind of shorter than other polling companies may do, but in any case, it's a large group of people. And I emphasize as well, single source, to be clear that all of these people are going in through the same website, through the same mechanism. We don't aggregate lots of smaller panels together under one brand name, but we quite literally are one single unified panel. And because of the fact that we're a panel, this gives us two big advantages. Firstly, it gives us much more control over the entire process of running a poll. So instead of just kind of plucking respondents out the void from a third-party provider and then doing the results, I can see all previous results a respondent has given us over the years. They might have done surveys with us. We can send emails to them at specific times. We control every aspect of how our website looks to them. And that arguably means that we can do better quality polling. But maybe more important for this presentation, it also means we have lots and lots of data. The mechanism, the way in which our panel works, and I can explain this later if desired, is everyone will answer at least one question every single day, whether we have a commission project or not. So we have enormous amounts of data, which we're just not really doing anything with. So when I joined Find Out Now last year, I kind of said to my boss at the time, we should run lots of interesting polling. And that's something which we started to do in the last year. Of which the main example of this is our voting intention polling. So particularly since, I believe it was November last year, but particularly since January, we've launched a weekly voting intention tracker, i.e. we ask people, how do you plan to vote at the next election? And we report those results. And on this graph on the right, you can kind of see what that looks like. So back in January, we had Reform narrowly ahead, but basically Reform, Labour, Conservative having a three-way tie with not much between them. And what we've seen then is Reform have overwhelmingly grown to be the largest party, with the Conservatives in a distant third and Labour in between. And this both has been fun to do because, we have the capacity, we have the data, why not do something with it? But this has also got us a lot of attention, some of it good, some of it bad, as I'll outline. So if we move to the next slide here, the main point to note about our voting intentions are we have found Reform to do far, far better than other pollsters recently have. If you follow us on Twitter, you'll definitely be aware of this. And we receive a lot of vitriol for it. And I've just sent a screenshot here of a kind of a polling aggregator, so a website which, as you can tell, Wikipedia, which collects every national voting intention survey done and kind of just lists out the results, what scores are given by what party, who the client was, etc. And as you can see, most pollsters are kind of gravitating towards Reform leading by anywhere between 4 and 7 points over Labour. And if you stuck that into a kind of election seat projector, this would be something like Reform being the largest party, but maybe not enough to form a majority government. And although these are different pollsters using different methods at different times, they've more or less gravitated towards the same outcome. And then you'll notice Find Out Now there on the second row, where we have a significant divergence between us and other pollsters. So just to give a comparison between us and YouGov, who published a poll at roughly the same time, we found a 14-point lead for Reform over Labour, so Reform on 34% and Labour on 20%, where YouGov only found a 4-point lead. And this is notable because this isn't just, it's not the case that, we have a poll which is outside of the margin of error, or this is one exception to the rule, but normally we're in line. But this marks a substantial divergence between us and other pollsters. And that basically forms the base of this presentation, us explaining why this divergence exists and why we think we're right. Or at the very least, if we're not right, why we're not wrong, which is similar but maybe slightly different. And also, as I mentioned on the slide here, worth noting that we were the first pollster to find Reform leading over the Conservatives back in December, and also the first pollster, I believe, back in January or February, who found Reform leading over Labour. So eventually everybody else found the same thing, but we were the first to initially suggest it. And the problem with running voting intention polling is that you can't prove your results are right. I mean, obviously, an election, a national one at least, only happens every 5 or 4 years. And outside of that time period, you can kind of say what you want and no one can prove you wrong. But luckily for us, or unluckily for some, there were local elections in England back in May. I think it was May the 1st, May the 4th, early May, first Thursday of May. And this provided at least one opportunity for us to test, how well is our polling performing compared to a real life test of this data. And so there were mayoral elections in several areas of England. So from memory, there was Hull and East Yorkshire, there was West of England, there was Greater Cambridgeshire, and there was also Greater Lincolnshire. And we ran polls in all those areas. And there was also the kind of local council elections, which you could compare your results against. So firstly, on the mayoral polling, there were 3 pollsters who ran polls on these mayoral polls. So it was More in Common, Find Out Now, and YouGov. And Find Out Now narrowly were found the most accurate of all pollsters on this. So if you measure by average error, i.e. how much we were off by on each candidate, we had the lowest score of any pollster, which we were very happy about. And then there was also the local elections. And as an aside here, I should note that they are very, very, very difficult to poll. The problem is that only a third of people vote in them, and at any one time, only something like a quarter of the country is actually voting in a local election. This makes it near impossible to actually meaningfully predict these elections, and the predictions all over the place. However, luckily for us, there are some social scientists who, not sure who funds them, but I'm very glad they are, who basically come up with national estimates, i.e. they take all these local election results and they say, had the entire country, instead of only small parts of the country voted, what would the overall vote shares have been? And you can see 2 of these examples here. So that's on the left, there's the national estimated share, or maybe national estimated vote. I think I might have actually misread that. And the other one was the projected national share. And they use slightly different methodologies. I think one focuses more on changes of vote share. The other instead takes representative portions of the areas which did vote. So maybe one rural area, one urban, one working class, etc. You don't have to understand that. The point here is that, these were the outcomes they predicted, which were pretty close to what Find Out Now found. So on that third graph there is Find Out Now's most recent voting intention poll before the local elections. So I believe there might have been the 29th of April which was a Wednesday, and the local elections happening on a Thursday the next day. And what we found was that our results were far closer to these local election national equivalent votes than the pollster average. So if you look at the pollster average, that was the average of 4 other pollsters, excluding us, who also did voting intentions in the week prior. They basically had Labour and Reform neck and neck with Conservatives in third place. Meanwhile, Find Out Now had Reform overwhelmingly leading, with Labour and the Conservatives in a distant second and third. And I suppose I should mention here that it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, because people obviously maybe act differently in a local election compared to a national one. You know, the kind of person who maybe votes for a Lib Dem councillor in their area might not be voting for a Lib Dem MP. So it's not a perfect comparison, but I think it's close enough that it is worth us mentioning, maybe an apples and pears comparison, if, you know, to really torture this poor analogy. But I think the point here is that if you had 2 journalists, one only had the Find Out Now data and one only had the pollster average data, I think the Find Out Now data would have given a much more faithful, much more illuminating narrative of what was happening in these elections, i.e. Reform was well ahead and everyone else is in a distant second and third, than the pollster average at the time, which says, oh, Reform and Labour are neck and neck. And I should say as well, just last point on that slide, both, you know, in a professional sense, it was a relief to see the final local election results, to see Reform had performed so well. Maybe for the country, not a good thing. Depends what your kind of background is, I suppose, and your political inclination. But for us, we'd had months of predicting Reform much higher than everyone else. And my boss at the time saying, oh, Tyron, are you sure that's correct? And I was saying, I trust the data, I trust our methodology hold the line. So obviously, this isn't the perfect confirmation that our results are good, but at least it's given us some evidence to suggest that we might be in the right direction. So yeah, that was a very pleasant Thursday, May the 1st, to see those results and think, wow, our polling results aren't horrifically wrong. So now I want to talk a bit about long-term polling, because obviously I've shown you there that Reform are overwhelmingly leading at the polls. They performed very well in the local elections. But I think some people still have a significant degree of skepticism that Reform could actually be doing this well. And I think, to be honest, this is quite well founded. So as you see that graph on the top right, that's from Electoral Calculus, who we do lots of work with. And they basically take a poll from all pollsters and they do an estimate for what the seat share would be if an election was held on that basis. And as you can see, they're suggesting that Reform would go from winning 5 votes at the last election to 325 now. And, you know, for anyone, I think that would stretch the imagination of being possible that, oh, is this party, which was only founded, 2, maybe 3 years ago, who've had, shall we say, some internal organizational instability, going from 4 MPs to 5 MPs to 4 MPs and whatever, is it realistic to suggest that they will do well enough in the polls to win the next election? And I think if that's the only data you had, you'd be very, you know, it would be very reasonable to suggest some skepticism and doubt of those figures. But I actually want to provide a counter argument based on other long-term polling, just to kind of, you know, set the scene. So the first one is the British Social Attitude Survey. This is one of those delightful social science tracker surveys, which has run every year since 1983, so for over 40 years at this point. And they ask questions on a wide variety of different topics like abortion or sexuality or should the government spend more. But for our interest, they also run questions on levels of trust in government, levels of trust in politics, satisfaction with different elements of our government and politics today. And they found in their 2025 release the lowest ever level of trust in government that they've ever seen. In a similar vein, they asked a question saying, do you trust politicians to tell the truth in a tight corner? They found the lowest ever levels of agreement they've ever had to that question. And in addition to that, they ask whether you're satisfied or dissatisfied with the NHS. Dissatisfaction is at its highest level ever, you know, higher than during COVID, higher than at the end of the 1990s when it was a big scandal. You know, Britain is a very unhappy country currently based on this data. And in my view, on that basis, it's perhaps not surprising that a right-wing populist party is doing well. And really, this drop is really horrific. So I think the question on trust in government was, do you trust the government to represent the interests of the nation rather than that of their own party? And in the 1980s, you know, this was Thatcher, miners' strike, all this controversy. You had over 40% of people saying, yes, I do trust the government to act in the interests of the nation and not their party. The same thing for 2025 is 12%. So really, people are very distrusting of our current political establishment. And I think on that basis, the fact that they might be voting for Reform in large numbers is perhaps not surprising. And in addition, if we look at the 2024 general election, Labour won an overwhelming majority. However, they won that majority on the lowest ever vote share post-war, that is, so since 1945, for a party who then formed a majority government. So from memory, they only got 34% of the vote, i.e. 2/3 of people did not vote for Labour, yet despite that, Labour won this enormous majority. It was also the second lowest turnout election ever. It was only lower than that in 2001 from memory, and I think it's fair to say people didn't vote then because they were generally happy, so didn't need to vote. Whereas in 2024, they probably thought, what's the point in voting? Everything's awful, nothing will change. So when people and commentators say, oh, why are the public not giving Labour a chance? Or why did Labour not have a honeymoon period? I think it's fair to say that, well, most people didn't vote for them, so why would they be giving them that chance? So I think whenever you're looking at anything in British politics, you should hold these things in mind. Record low levels of trust. Labour got into government on a record low level of vote. So again, not surprising that they're now running into troubles. Water break. So that takes us to, apologies, we're not even at the main bulk of the presentation yet. So to give a summary so far, Find Out Now has been a consistent outlier of reform voting intentions. However, based on our recent performance and arguably some long-term polling, we think that if we're not right, then at least we're not completely wrong. And we believe there are three specific factors, which we can talk about, which are causing pollsters in general to understate the reform vote share. And these are too many highly engaged respondents, turnout being overstated, and false recall of 2024 general election vote. And I'll go through each of those in turn. So the first one, and just to note, I've given a numbers. So I've a tendency of meandering and giving lots of data. So I put numbers at the corner so you can kind of follow where we are. So this first point, too many highly engaged respondents, we'll talk about now. So when you're running voting intention polling, or indeed any polling, I would argue that there's kind of three component parts. And I would just say this isn't a scheme I've taken from somewhere, I've kind of just made it up. So if there are flaws in it, they're entirely my own. The first tenet of this is the raw sample. This is, where do your respondents actually come from? Did you get them on the internet? Did you telephone call them? Did you find them in the street? And that's really important. That's part one. Part two is what I'm crudely calling the methodology. So what questions did you ask? So are you asking them, how do you vote if there's an election tomorrow? Are you asking them, how would your friends and family vote? If somebody says they don't know how they're going to vote, how are you dealing with that? And that's what I'd call the methodology. And in the third category, I would call modeling. So this is how do you translate the results you have to, for example, who's going to win the next general election? And it's my impression from, being in the polling industry a few years that all of the kind of initial, all of the initiative and energy and kind of sexiness in the polling industry in recent times has been in that modeling camp. So if you followed the last election in detail, you'd have seen an amass of what are called MRP polls, so multi-level regression and post-stratification polling, where people, they ran polls of 10,000 and then ran a fancy algorithm or model and spat out the results. People have got very comfortable and very excited about that element of this polling pipeline. But it seems to me that people have paid far too little attention to the raw sample part of the equation, i.e. where do your respondents actually come from? And the reason for this is that more or less in the UK, everybody does online polling. I think there's only one pollster left who still does telephone polling. And in reality, almost nobody does kind of door-to-door, face-to-face polls. So because of that, we've all become quite complacent thinking, given we're all doing polling the same way, we don't have to talk about it anymore. And to kind of give a slightly, again, another tortured analogy, because I'm a fan of those, imagine polling to be, say, a kitchen or at a restaurant. In recent years, we've said, our chefs have learned lots of new recipes and they're plating the meals better and they're doing it far quicker than ever before, but they're still buying all of their raw produce from, say, Tesco or Aldi or something. And, maybe that's fine. Maybe that's not a problem, but we should at least be talking about it. Like, maybe you should try out a few suppliers. Maybe you should, get better high quality ingredients. And I'll go into this in more detail, but that has been my observation of the polling industry, which really leads us on to this point of over-engagement. So a big issue for all polling is that, to be honest, normal people do not sign up to do surveys. If you think about it, who wants to spend 10 minutes a day or 20 minutes sitting in front of a survey saying, do you agree, strongly agree, disagree? Are you satisfied, dissatisfied? Which of the following brands have you seen in the last 30 days? Like, an average normal person is not signing up to do this kind of polling. And what this means, particularly for political polling, is that your average person who says, yes, I do want to give my opinion, or yes, I do want to spend half an hour of my life asking questions about politics, they're likely to be much more politically engaged than the average person. So your kind of person who doesn't really care about politics, doesn't really follow the news, isn't too bothered, are probably not going to be doing a poll on those topics. And this is a problem due to something called non-ignorable non-response. And I didn't create this term, and I recognize it's very clunky, but I think it does kind of describe itself well. This is where the reasons for somebody not doing your survey is related to the topic of the survey itself. So by contrast, if you think about ignorable non-response, imagine that you knocked on people's doors to ask them questions, but somebody was on the phone so couldn't answer the door, or they just popped out to the shops or something like that. That would be ignorable non-response, because sure, they didn't respond to your survey, but it's probably a random chance reason and probably isn't going to influence your results. On the other hand, non-ignorable non-response is where the reasons for someone not doing your survey are linked to the survey itself. So in this case, if you're asking, I don't know, the classic example is government health surveys. If you do a survey saying, do you trust the government about COVID? The problem is the kind of people who don't trust the government about COVID also don't trust survey companies. So you're not actually going to successfully reach those individuals. So applying this to voting intention polling, this is normally not an issue for election polling, because sure, we completely fail to get non-engaged voters, but non-engaged voters don't vote anyway. So these problems kind of cancel out. So your sample is skewed, but it doesn't really matter if your only aim is kind of predicting the results of the next election. But I would argue that in recent years, this has now changed. And at the bottom here, I just have a quote from a fellow pollster, James Johnson, who is British, but also does polling in the United States, and who correctly predicted that Trump would win this election, and one of a handful of pollsters who did so. And when he was commenting on American politics in one editorial, I really like this quote, which was that, pollsters kind of understated the kind of people who would vote for Trump, who don't want to be doing surveys. They don't have time to be doing surveys. They don't want to be talking to pollsters. And because of that, pollsters missed them out. And because of that, they mispredicted the election. So that's kind of the theory. Now let's put it into practice. So people voting reform now are far, far more politically engaged than they were a year ago. So on this graph, we have a question which is the standard used in political polling, which is how much attention do you generally pay to politics? And what this shows is the average score for the same group of people over time. So if you take that reform line, each point is the same group of people. So it's not the case that we ask 4 groups of reform voters at 4 different times, but I really want to emphasize these were the same groups of people that we asked on 4 different occasions. And what you can see is that the people who right now are telling us, yes, I'm voting reform, a year ago, they really weren't that interested in politics. Their political attention was far lower than it was for Labour voters or Green or even Conservative. And that has completely changed. In the last year, 2 years, reform voters have become, you could say radicalized, but at the very least, far more politically engaged than before. So their average score has gone from something like 5 out of 10 political engagement to something like 6.57 out of 10. But I actually think that understates it, because that means there's a large group of people who previously were, let's say, 0, 1, 2, 3, and are now more like 8, 9, 10. So reform very much have woken up a brand new constituency of people who previously weren't really engaging in politics. And this is borne out in our ongoing voting intention polling that we do each week. So of the 2024 voters or non-voters, so people who could have voted last time but didn't, of those people who now say, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to vote this time, 2/3 of them say they'll vote for reform. So it does seem that reform has successfully mobilized this new constituency of voters, which otherwise weren't really engaging. And this is a problem for polling, because as I mentioned before, political panels and particularly online polling overwhelmingly understates low political engagement people, i.e. people who aren't interested in politics and generally aren't engaged are also unlikely to be doing polling. However, if reform is now getting most of their support from this group, that means that all else held equal, most pollsters will be understating the reform vote. So you can see here that we have a voting intention we conducted 2 months ago back in May, and we broke it down by people's political attention as of the general election last year. And as you can see, in that low political attention group, reform absolutely dominate, right? They have far, far, far greater share of the vote amongst that low political attention group than any other party. By contrast, if you look at the high attention group, these are the people who will, often be doing polling, they're still leading, but it's very much neck and neck with Labour. So I think this underscores a lot of the problems we're seeing in polling now. So if you're only successfully polling that high political attention group, sure, you might show a narrow reform lead, but you're not really getting the actual breadth of the change which has happened in recent years. Whereas if you're more successfully able to capture that low political attention group, your end results will be very much different with a much higher reform vote. And so to link it back to the original point of the presentation, so how come Find Out Now is showing a higher reform lead than others? Well, this first reason, which I think of the 3 reasons is probably the most important, is that Find Out Now is much, much better at capturing low attention voters than other panels. And there's a few key reasons for this. So actually, firstly, this graph on the right basically shows various panels. So we've got 2 versions of Find Out Now and 3 versions of what's called the British Election Study, which is kind of the gold standard of political surveys in the UK, which is normally run with YouGov. And the first 2 were door-to-door, and the third one was run online. And what you can see here is that Find Out Now has a much higher proportion of low attention voters than these other panels. So we have, when waiting on pass vote, which I can explain if desired, 41% of people who fall into that low political attention group. By contrast, the YouGov online survey has only 25%, which is quite a substantial divergence. And obviously, we can't say what the true level of political attention in the public is, because, how do you prove that? Do we ask it in the census or what? But it does seem to me that our numbers are the most accurate, because obviously 40% of people who could have voted the last election didn't. And that seems to track quite well with our 41% who say they're low political attention. So why is it that Find Out Now is able to get these people more than other panels are able to? And there's 3 key reasons. Firstly, our respondents never signed up to do surveys. This sounds counterintuitive, but imagine if you see an ad saying, oh, we really want your opinion, sign up to do a survey, you're going to bias towards people who have opinions and like giving them. Meanwhile, for Find Out Now, we have a consumer site, which is called Pick My Postcode, which is a free daily postcode lottery. So people sign up because, they check a few minutes each day to see if they've won. And while they're there, we say, do you feel like doing a survey? So they never said, yes, I want to do surveys now. That's more a kind of accidental byproduct of their experience on our site. And that's why we're able to kind of reach an audience which maybe other panels struggle to do. The second reason is that our respondents are not paid to do surveys. So what normally happens is, with a traditional panel, they will say have a 20-minute survey, which has packed as much questions as they can within that 20 minutes. Because obviously you're paying someone, say, £3 for 20 minutes. You want to get as much bang for your buck as possible. And a respondent has every interest to lie and cheat. Why? Because, you want to get your £3 as quick as possible. So you're going to speed through that survey. Or if it says, for example, in the US, are you African-American, or are you Latino, or are you a Republican? People will lie because they know if they click yes, they'll be showing more kind of paying surveys. So it creates some bad incentives, which luckily Find Out Now is able to entirely avoid, because we by and large don't pay people. And the last reason is that our surveys are very, very, very short. So as I mentioned, the average survey in this industry might be 5 or 10 or 20 minutes long, because you have to get someone in front of a screen. You have to say, agree, let's do a survey. And once you've got them in front of that screen, you want to get as much in as you can in one go. Meanwhile, with Find Out Now, because our respondents basically do one very short survey every day, and often the survey is quite literally just a single question, we have a very different model. So for our ongoing weekly voting intentions, our average user takes 16 seconds, 16 seconds to do that poll. And so you can imagine, if there's somebody who doesn't really care about politics, who's not particularly interested, who's not too bothered, they are much more likely to be doing our 16-second survey rather than a 20-minute one. And again, it's hard to conclusively prove these things, but I think that as a result, we're much better able to reach an audience which other panels struggle to get. And the last point here, which is maybe more pollster specific, so if this doesn't make more sense, don't worry, is that some pollsters recognize this problem. They know that there's issues with engagement bias in polling, and they try and solve this by weighting. So weighting is where you collect your raw data, and then you want to basically adjust that data to be representative of the public at large. So say that you need people under 30, and people under 30 are 18% of the public, which they actually are. I don't know why I kind of committed that one to memory. But let's say you only had 10% in your sample who are that age. What you would do is you'd upweight those respondents, so they would count kind of twice as much. So that way, even if your raw data is slightly imperfect, your final weighted data is much better. And so what some pollsters are starting to do is they're trying to weight on engagement. So they're saying, only 20% of our sample are low engagement when it should be 40%. So we're going to upweight these respondents. And, this could be, again, a whole presentation in itself. But my gut feel is that this isn't really a solution for a few reasons. Firstly, it assumes that a low engagement person who is doing surveys is fully interchangeable with a low engagement person who doesn't. And that is a kind of a strong claim to make, which isn't necessarily true. And if you read that quote on the right-hand side, that is from an American academic who's written a book on polling. And they just make this point that, weighting might actually make your data worse, while at the same time making you more confident about bad data. The second reason why this might not work is that political attention as a question, so the question, how much attention are you paid to politics, may no longer be a very good proxy. Because as we saw, reform voters are now much more likely to be engaged in politics than before. So although they're now paying more attention to politics, they may be, just as disinclined to do surveys as they were before. So that question is no longer reliable as a weighting metric. And then obviously for a final point, what are you basing those weights on? So are you going to run a survey on political engagement and then copy those weights and use that for your surveys going forward? Because obviously that first survey might have flaws. And also you'd be basing your weights on a single point of time when as we saw off that graph, political attention can change quite rapidly. So again, no worries if this all went over your head, because this is very pollster specific, but that's the reason that I think weighting by political engagement is no substitute for actually having a sample whose natural fallout has enough voters in that category. So that takes us to our second, so that was the first reason, too many over-engaged voters, which in my view is causing reform to be understated. And this is the second explanation, which is overstated turnout. Now, pollsters want to make sure, and also I should say too, if there's any questions which have come to mind, put them in the chat, and then at the end we can refer back to old questions. So the second reason is overstating turnout. So pollsters want to make sure that their sample of voters that they collect, those 2,000 respondents which they gather for a survey, do well represent people who will actually vote. And there's no perfect way of doing this. So different pollsters have had success with very different methods. So a few might be that you might ask as a single question, how would you vote if there was an election tomorrow? And you might have an option for, I wouldn't vote. Or you might do what we do at Find Out Now, which is we have a separate likelihood to vote question. So the first question is, are you likely to vote at the next election? And the second is, how would you vote? And then we only show results for people who say they would actually vote. Because, if there's lots of people who say, I definitely wouldn't vote, but if I voted, I'd vote green, that is actively harmful to the accuracy of your final predictions. Or some pollsters who are smarter than I have very fancy turnout models. So they basically say people are untrustworthy, are very bad at self-reporting their behavior. So instead, they've got lots of demographics and whatever, and they have an algorithm which says, this voter, based on everything we know about them, has this probability of actually voting. And obviously, of course, there's the method for doing this, but also your raw sample has a big impact on how many of those respondents then say they're likely to vote. And doing this correctly or doing a good job of it is very important for correctly forecasting voting intention, especially if there's a turnout differential between different parties. So, for example, say, I don't know, Labour voters were much more likely to vote than Conservative voters. Making sure you've got your overall level of turnout correct is crucial to make sure that that trend is actually reflected in your final results. And this takes us to this slide and this graph. So it's very interesting that when you plot all the different pollsters who are currently doing voting intentions and plot basically the reform lead over Labour on one side and their estimated level of turnout on the bottom. So I call it implied turnout. It's also called sample of likely voters. There's a very clear divergence. On one hand, between pollsters who think the election will have a relatively low turnout with a very high reform lead versus those pollsters who predict a very high turnout with a low reform lead. And it should be said that this is a very statistically significant phenomenon. You don't have to know what a peanut or an adjusted R-squared number is, but just trust that this is not a random graph which has just spontaneously happened, but there is a clear relationship between these two factors. And as you can see, Find It Now is at the top left of this graph. So we predict a very high reform lead over Labour on a very low turnout, and the likes of, say, YouGov on the bottom right, where they predict a higher turnout election with a lower reform lead. And this line in the middle shows the 2024 general election turnout. So just in principle, my gut feel would be, based on my knowledge of UK politics and what's happened in the last year, I would find it very unlikely that the turnout would significantly exceed what it was last time. So when polling numbers are showing a turnout which are significantly in excess of that, my immediate thought is there may be something wrong here or something we should talk about. Meanwhile, Find Out Now's numbers, we're on 53% turnout, which is quite low, admittedly, but I definitely think that's on the right-hand side on the correct side of the graph for predicting turnout at the next election. And for those who are kind of eagle-eyed on watching pollsters over time, at the 2024 general election, our implied turnout was 65%, and the final turnout was 60%. So again, we had a slight overestimate last year, but it was still pretty close. And so why is this important, or why is this happening? The reason is that reform voters are more likely to vote than voters of other parties. So when you ask people the question, are you likely to vote at the next election? Reform voters are much more likely to say, I'm definitely going to vote. And the local election supported this. So here's a great graph from Ben Walker at New Statesman. And he basically plotted all of the local election results in May and the reform, the number of reform votes and how the turnout had changed in the last 5 years. And what he's shown here is that basically areas where reform won had the largest increase in turnout this time compared to the last time there was an election there. And the obvious conclusion to draw from that is reform has successfully mobilized a new constituency of people who previously weren't voting, but now both are voting and are voting reform. And the problem is, when you're running a poll, if you estimate a high turnout, or if your methods and panel and methodology implicitly suggest that turnout will be very high, you in effect flatten this difference between reform and other parties. So if you say that the election is going to have an 80% turnout, at that point, there's going to be very little difference between, say, Reform and Labour. So this very important Reform advantage is ignored. Meanwhile, when it's kind of like a glacier, you know, if sea levels are high enough, you can't see it. Whereas when sea levels are slightly lower, you know, the peaks and troughs become more visible. And so, yeah, if you overstate turnout, you're likely to flatten this Reform advantage, which in turn understates their vote share. And again, this isn't something we can specifically prove because, again, saying how many people are going to vote in the next election halfway through the cycle is very tricky. But my gut feel would be that in general, lower turnouts are likely to be more accurate. And as such, higher reform leads over Labour are also likely to be more accurate. But, you know, that's obviously subject to debate. And that takes us to our third and final reason, and we should still hopefully have time for questions. So this reason is called false recall. And I'll give a warning that this is, of all the three reasons, the most kind of polling industry heavy. So again, if this slightly goes over your head, it's not your fault. It's just a very methodologically heavy and specific point of view. But hopefully I presented it in a way which makes sense. So false recall is where survey respondents misremember, forget, or deliberately misrepresent their past behavior. So that's basically, say, for example, you ask people, did you brush your teeth yesterday? Everyone is going to say yes, because saying no is kind of embarrassing. You're admitting to something wrong. So people may have false recall because they're basically lying. Another example is where people genuinely forget. If you say, how did you vote in 2005? A lot of people won't really remember, or they'll have a kind of a partial memory. And that also becomes a false recall where their recollection or their stated recollection of what happened is different from what actually happened. And some famous examples of this include the Iraq War. So at the time in 2003, if you ask people, do you support the Iraq War? The majority of people said yes. However, if you ask nowadays and ask people who are old enough, 20 years ago, did you support it? Everyone says, no, I opposed it. So clearly they were influenced by future events and they've kind of overwritten and changed that prior memory. So when we apply this to voting intention, this occurs in a few ways. So say, for example, there's somebody who in their constituency voted for the Lib Dems because the Lib Dems have the best chance of winning, but they're actually in reality a Green voter. When you ask them, how did you vote last time? They may say, I voted Green because that's their favorite party, when in reality they maybe didn't. The second example is where people are embarrassed to tell the truth. And we saw this quite interestingly in 2019. YouGov did a really fun study where people who voted for Corbyn in 2017 were very reluctant to admit in 2019 that they still had voted for Corbyn, which caused a big kind of issue in calculating the voting intention numbers. There's also people who simply forget. You know, we're here watching a webinar, in my case, giving it on political polling. Most people really do not care. You know, for them, politics is something which happens every 5 years. They're not that interested. They don't have strong opinions. They're not paying much attention to it. So if you say to them, how did you vote a year ago? They might remember, but they might not, and that's completely fine. And then there's also that example of people who have overwritten their old memory. And actually, that's the one that we're specifically going to focus on here. And in general, this is very important for polling because almost all political polling in the UK, actually bar one or two companies, but I would say 90% of the companies who do voting intention polling, they weight based on past vote, i.e. if 25% of the public voted Labour last election, they want to make sure that 25% of their sample are Labour voters. And the only way to do that is to basically ask people, how did you vote, and then weighting accordingly. And that takes us to this next slide. So what has happened here is that we ran a survey. So when I went earlier at the beginning, I mentioned how we're not a pollster, but a panel. This is important because pollsters, they basically pluck 2,000 respondents out of the void. They run a survey, but then they never see those respondents again. So they can't link all of this data in one massive data set together. By contrast, at Find Out Now and one or two other companies, so I think Ipsos and YouGov in the UK would be the biggest examples, we do run our own panel. So that means for one respondent, I can see every single survey answer they've ever given me over the last, say, 5 years. What that means, which is very relevant for this, is I can ask them right now, how did you vote at the last election? And I can compare that to what they said in July 2024, i.e. just after the last election. And that's what this graph shows here. So we asked a bunch of 2024 Conservative voters, so people who told us in July last year they voted Conservative, and we said to them a year later, oh, how did you vote at the last election? And what's really interesting is that the 2024 Conservatives who are still planning to vote Conservative now, they say, oh yes, I voted Conservative. You know, they have no issues with their memory. There was no false recall present there. However, for those 2024 Conservatives who have since said they'll vote for reform, a substantial portion of them, roughly 1 in 7, now say, oh, I voted reform. So what's likely happening here is that there might have been people who in the past year have basically become very strong reform supporters. And as a result, they've overwritten their previous memory. So even though we know they voted Conservative because they told us a year ago, they've now remembered themselves having voted reform. And this is really, well, not bad per se, but it causes problems for traditional voting intention polling. Because as I say, Find Out Now as a panel, we can compare people's current answers to their old answers. So when I assemble a sample for a voting intention poll, and I know I need 25% be Labour voters, I can look at people's answers that they gave us a year ago, right? So I am fairly, confident that those results are accurate because they told us it right after the election. By contrast, most pollsters do not have this advantage. Most pollsters are using third-party panels where they don't have this kind of historic data on every respondent. What that means is, in order to wait on past vote, which almost every pollster does, they have to re-ask this question every single survey. So when you start the survey, you might be asked, what's your gender, what's your age, where are you from, how did you vote, before even getting to the main bulk of the questions. What this means is the pollsters who aren't a panel have to re-ask this question every survey. And as a result, due to what we saw in this graph here, they are accidentally mistyping a lot of 2024 Conservatives as actually being 2024 reform, which is inaccurate. So just to be clear, this is a clear error. It's not a matter of interpretation. If this result stands, that would be a clear inaccuracy in the polling. And the problem here is that this suppresses the reform vote. Because what happens is it makes the 2024 Conservative vote look far more loyal than it actually is, which then suggests that the Conservatives are going to do far better than they actually are. By contrast, so what they're basically doing is they're assigning voters to being Conservative when they should actually be assigning them to being Reform. And this is a big problem. And to be honest, it's tricky because unless you do run a panel directly yourself, there's no easy way to correct for this phenomenon. And it's worth saying too that pollsters are aware of this problem. This isn't a brand new thing. This is false recall as a term which has been used in market research for decades. But I think it's fair to say that pollsters probably didn't think that a year after the election, they'd have to be thinking about this. In their heads, they might have thought, yes, by 2029, we need to have a correction for this. But in 2025, that seems awfully soon. But as we've seen, the voting intention and the British public is so volatile that this problem has kind of reared its head far earlier than otherwise. So that is all the 3 reasons. So to give a quick summary of all the reasons so far. So yeah, to begin, Find It Now has been a consistent outlier on reform voting intentions, which as you're attending this webinar, you're probably already aware of. We would argue our recent performance suggests that this isn't an error, and instead we point to 3 specific things which we think are causing pollsters to understate reform. The first one is that their panels have too many highly engaged respondents. Highly engaged people are less likely to vote reform. As such, they understate the reform vote. That's number 1. Number 2 is that they overstate turnout. So reform voters are more likely to vote than voters of other parties. But if you estimate a very high turnout, it hides that effect, which understates their vote share. And finally, we think there's a false recall where the Conservatives are getting an artificial boost compared to reform for people who don't have a panel, but instead have to re-ask the 2024 general election question every single time. And we would argue that the combined impact of these likely explain the majority of the difference between Find Out Now and other pollsters. Very much subject to debate. I'd very much welcome constructive criticism from anyone, laymen, other people in the polling industry. But yeah, we did this research, thought it was interesting, thought we'd share it, and we very much welcome comments. So that takes us to the final Q&A section. And yeah, there's a few questions. We're technically running over, but I mean, I've got nothing on now, so feel free to leave and come back to the link after, but I'll answer as many questions as we have time to do. So the first question is, do you think reform will climb to 40% plus in the near future due to current conditions? I think what we've seen with reform, actually, if I go back to one of the earlier slides, because there was a graph which potentially is useful for this, if I shine through. Yeah, you can see that whenever we've thought reform have plateaued, they've actually grown again. So they grew in November, December to overtake the Conservatives, then they plateaued. Then they grew again up until the local elections, plateaued. After the local elections, they grew again, plateaued. So it really does feel like every single time they're slightly growing. Will they reach 40%? I don't know. I think it's likely that they'll maintain their current vote share unless there's some true crisis in the party, or unless the Conservatives or Labour substantially change their game, of which there's no particular indications of that happening. I suppose the point to make, though, is that Labour at the last election won a majority of the vote, or won a majority in Parliament on 34% of the vote. If Reform even stay on 34% with a far more fragmented electoral landscape, they can win a majority on a far lower share. So even if they don't reach 40, that might not matter. But yeah, too hard to say, but I definitely wouldn't bet against them growing further. I see no indications of them plateauing in the long term. Second question, how many Westminster seats will Reform win in Scotland, do you think? Is there polls for Wales and Holyrood elections? My initial gut feel is that they'll win 0 votes in Scotland, not because they aren't popular. Like, I think they're averaging, what, 20-25% of the vote, but I just think in Scotland, there's a far more unified coalition against reform. So I can't imagine. So what's happened previously, right, is that, let's say it's Labour versus SNP in a constituency, your Lib Dem voters and your Conservative voters will vote Labour to keep SNP out. I really can't see a Lib Dem or a Green voting reform against SNP. Like, I think it just becomes far too fragmented again. So they might pit past the post in certain constituencies and maybe win, say, 30% of the vote, but are still in first place. But I can't see them in the long run winning lots of Westminster seats. Regarding Holyrood and Senedd, so the Wales and Scotland polls, we ran a Wales poll, I think, a month or 2 ago. We're probably due to run another one again. And we had Reform being in the lead with Plaid Cymru in second place, or maybe them tied, I can't remember exactly. But I think next May will be very, very interesting, because in Wales and Scotland, they use proportional voting systems. So it's far easier for Reform to kind of get a bunch of votes and successfully win a bunch of seats in a way which is much harder in Westminster. So they're definitely going to do well. Probably would struggle to get Westminster seats in Scotland, probably be fine in Wales. But truth be told, I'm not an expert on either constituency. So I guess we shall see. Can tactical voting affect the next election results? Definitely, but very much too early to say how. My gut feel is that tactical voting has always been somewhat overplayed. Like, generally, there's been an anti-Conservative alliance. So say the Lib Dem voter will vote Labour, the Labour voter will vote Lib Dem, the Green voter will help out. But I don't actually know how many votes are genuinely being decided on that basis. Like, it might be a few dozen seats here and there are decided by that. But I think in principle, most people are probably voting for the party they most like. Again, I'm not an expert on tactical voting at UK elections, but yeah, that would be my gut feel. I suppose if there's an environment where it feels like Reform may be the largest party, maybe there'll be a coalition of people saying, you know, vote Labour to keep Reform out, vote Lib Dem to keep Reform out. But again, it's so volatile. Like, you know, I grew up near Tunbridge Wells, and that's currently a Lib Dem MP. But previously, it was a Conservative. So would a Conservative really vote for their enemy, the Lib Dem, to keep Reform out? And also, if Reform have a chance of being the largest party, there's a good chance that Conservative voters will tactically vote for Reform. So I do think it can go either way. But one interesting tidbit to keep in mind is that although the vote shares for different parties go up and down, give or take, the left wing is on 50% and the right wing is on 50%. So in general, a lot of these electoral dynamics are simply how efficient is the left wing or the right wing at unifying their vote share. Right now, the right wing is doing better because Reform is the largest party, Conservative second place. Where the left wing, you know, you've got something like 3 or 4 parties each on 15% of the vote. But yeah, I think too early to say, but definitely worth keeping an eye on. How do you count? Actually, I'll read it, but I'll drink my water while reading it. How do you counter criticism that comparison to local elections, which typically have much lower turnout, is not the best indicator of voter turnout measures for Westminster elections? Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, we mentioned the local election stuff because, actually, can we keep the question on the screen? So it's a long one, I'm going to forget otherwise. We're not saying that because we did well in the local elections, we're absolutely perfect and everything's trustworthy. But it is worth saying that we did use the same methodology for the local elections that we are using for the Westminster elections going forward. So we didn't have any fancy turnout model. We just said to people, do you plan to vote in these elections? If yes, how are you going to vote? So we kind of trusted people. And I think it's interesting to note that so More in Common, where incidentally I used to work, they had some issues with their local election polling, mainly because they had a filter called likely voters. So instead of trusting people who said, oh, I'm actually going to vote this time, they instead came up with a model of, has this person previously voted at local elections, etc., which actually proved to be less accurate than if they trusted their raw data. So all that being said, I feel like, what am I thinking? I think in terms of measuring turnout, using the same method for both is legitimate. I guess the interesting thing is, linked to your point, is when we reach a general election, so a Westminster election, will all of these kind of shy Labour voters who aren't sure if they're going to vote, will they all of a sudden say, oh, actually, I wasn't going to vote for the last few years, but now I will? I think that's going to likely be the more bigger effect, but we're not going to really see that until the election itself. So, but I'm fairly confident though that if right now there genuinely was an election tomorrow, because the phrasing of our voting intention question is, if there was an election tomorrow, how would you vote? I am confident that it would be close to the results we see. But obviously there's a campaign, there's several years, which can change everything. Would you say that you're finding in recent polls that reform is beginning to have a ceiling? No, to be honest. Like, actually, our poll, which we published last Thursday, so fieldwork last Wednesday, had the largest reform lead we've ever seen. So at least for our polling, we're not seeing reform having a ceiling just yet. And I think in the long run, the interesting thing is that we've had several iterations of Nigel Farage-led parties, right? You know, we had UKIP and then the Brexit Party, and now finally Reform. I think I might have missed one. He's had a few. And the problem they had is that there was a ceiling, right? You had give or take 15% of the population who were maybe right-wing, didn't like the Conservatives, really cared about Brexit, really cared about immigration, and they really struggled to grow beyond that base. But the really interesting thing with Reform in recent times is that they have successfully grown beyond that base. So, you know, all Reform voters care at least a little about immigration, but Reform are finally gathering people who immigration isn't necessarily the number one or even the number two issue. So they are meaningfully becoming more than just a protest party, more than just a Brexit party, more than just an immigration party, which has allowed them to grow so substantially. I suppose the more interesting thing over the next year or two is, do the Conservatives have a floor? So the opposite of a ceiling, you know, the Conservatives in our polling are something like 16, 17%. Can they drop lower? And on that question, I'm not quite sure. Like, they definitely have a core vote, which is particularly pensioners. Some of those are starting moving to Reform, but yeah, I guess unless more Conservative voters move to Reform, I guess Reform probably can't grow much more. But I think it's far more likely in the near term that the Conservatives and Reform come to some kind of agreement. Although I should say that strays more into political analysis instead of polling, which, you know, is the bit I'm actually an expert on. Whereas, you know, anyone on the street can have opinions on what Reform and the Conservatives should do together. Next question. Do you think Reform UK will have the highest result at the next general election? Probably. I mean, I can't see any other party beating them. I mean, but again, the campaign is everything, right? We have a very volatile electorate. We have a very fragmented voter scene. And there's no reasons for that scene to unfragment because, you know, there's no election nearby. So there's no interest for parties to really butt heads and kind of sit down and say, how are we going to work together? So the campaign can change everything. But at least right now, I think if I had to bet money, I would bet that Reform would be the single largest party. Not sure if I'd bet them being a majority, but again, we're so many years away that it's hard to say. But yeah, cool. I think that was all the questions. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope this was informative and interesting. This YouTube link will stay live on YouTube, so you can still comment, share the link, comment, whatever. Yeah, hopefully that was useful. Thank you for listening and see you next time.